The ship was called the Eternal Verdict, and it was big enough to swallow a city block whole. It moved through deep space like a slow, heavy predator, its hull plated in dark alloy, its engines humming at a frequency that most human ears could not fully hear, but could always feel in their chest. It belonged to the Vanguard Coalition, an alliance of 5 alien species, who had been traveling the stars long before humanity had figured out how to leave its own solar system. The ship carried soldiers from all 5 of those species, and every one of them had a reason to feel proud of what they were. Corporal Jake Owens had just stepped onto the ship for the first time, and nobody was glad to see him. He was 26 years old, average height, lean but not bulky, with short brown hair and dark eyes that didn't give much away. He carried his gear in a standard-issue Coalition pack, wore the same gray and black armor as everyone else, and walked with the kind of quiet that came not from shyness, but from a habit of watching before speaking. He didn't look like much, and that, it turned out, was the first thing everyone noticed. The Vrethkai noticed first. They were the largest species aboard, 7 feet tall, reptilian, with thick green-gray scales that worked like natural armor. They had fought wars before humanity had built its first stone wall. Their muscles moved under their skin like cables under tension, and when they walked, the floor vibrated just a little. Their squad leader was a soldier named Vrax, broad-shouldered even by Vrethkai standards, with a long scar running from his jaw to his collarbone that he had never bothered to heal because he thought it looked better that way. Vrax looked at Jake the way someone looks at a broken tool, not with anger, just with mild disappointment that it had even been brought along. "This is the human?" he said to no one in particular, reading Jake's profile off the unit assignment board. 2 arms, no plating, no enhancements, average lifespan of 80 years. He made a low sound in his throat that translated roughly to a laugh. "They sent us a child who will die of old age before any of us even reach middle life." The Dunari soldiers standing nearby clicked their mandibles, which was their way of laughing too. The Dunari were insectoid, with 4 arms, compound eyes, and an exoskeleton that could absorb a plasma round at close range without cracking. They were fast, precise, and deeply practical. To them, Jake looked like something that would break if squeezed too hard. One of them, Ska, a young Dunari, who had been assigned to the same bunk row as Jake, watched the whole thing without clicking. He just watched. Jake heard all of it. He set his pack down on his assigned bunk, checked the latch on his rifle case, and said nothing. The bunk room smelled like machine oil and something like sulfur, which came from the Vrethkai. The lighting was dim and blue-tinted, calibrated for species whose eyes preferred lower wavelengths. Jake's eyes adjusted within a few seconds, which was something none of the aliens around him knew to notice. He unpacked in silence, folded his spare clothes, placed his boots at the foot of the bunk, took out a small worn photograph. A woman smiling in bright sunlight, standing in front of a house with a red door, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his vest without looking at it too long. Then he sat down, opened his rifle case, and began checking every component of his weapon with slow, careful hands. Ska watched him from across the room. The human didn't look upset. He didn't look embarrassed. He just looked like a man doing a job he had done many times before. "They're placing bets," Ska said quietly, coming over and sitting on the edge of the bunk across from Jake. His Coalition Standard translator collar buzzed softly as it converted his words. "On how many rotations before you request a transfer back to a human vessel?" Jake didn't look up from his rifle. "What are the odds?" 3 to 1 that you leave before the first patrol ends." Jake checked the firing pin, checked the charge cell, clicked everything back into place. "Good odds," he said. "For them." Scott tilted his head slightly, which among Dunari was a gesture of mild curiosity. "You are not angry?" "No." "Why not?" Jake finally looked up. His expression was even, unhurried, like a man who had made peace with something a long time ago. and didn't need to explain it. Because being angry about it won't change anything, and proving them wrong will. Ska was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Most species who are mocked respond with aggression or retreat." "Humans do both sometimes," Jake said, "but the ones worth watching do neither." He went back to cleaning his rifle. The first patrol briefing was held 2 hours later in the main operations deck. Commander Vrax stood at the front, projecting a map of their route along the outer rim near the Korath Nebula, a stretch of space known for pirate activity, illegal salvage operations, and occasionally worse. The mission was routine, Vrax said. Patrol, document, report. No engagement expected. Jake stood at the back of the room and studied the map with the kind of focus that most people saved for things that mattered. He noted the choke points, the spots where sensor coverage was thin, the direction the stellar winds moved debris, which would affect line of sight. He didn't write any of it down. He didn't need to. Vrax ran through the squad assignments. When he reached Jake's name and assigned him to the secondary unit, the unit that would stay behind and guard the ship while the real soldiers went out, there was a low ripple of amusement through the room. Not loud, just present, the kind of laughter that doesn't need a sound to be heard. Jake stood still and let it pass over him like water over stone. After the briefing, Gora, one of the Vrethkai soldiers, female, nearly as tall as Vrax, with amber eyes and a braid of dark scaling along her crest, stopped near him, on her way out. She looked down at him, with the kind of expression that wasn't quite contempt, but was close to it. "Don't get in the way," she said. "That's all we ask." Jake met her eyes. "I'll try to be useful," he said simply. She made a sound like gravel shifting, and walked away. That night, if it could be called night, since space had no such thing, and the ship simply dimmed its lights on a 24-hour cycle, Jake lay on his bunk with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. He was not anxious. He was not angry. He was thinking, the way a man thinks when he has trained a long time for something, and is simply waiting for it to begin. Above him, the ship hummed through the dark between stars. Nobody on board expected anything from him. That was fine. Jake had never needed anyone to expect things from him. He had always worked better as a surprise. He closed his eyes. He slept 6 hours exactly, and when the alarm sounded the next morning, he was the first one dressed and the first one at his post. The galaxy had no idea what it was about to meet. The alarm that woke the ship wasn't the slow, scheduled kind. It was sharp and red, and it cut through the dimmed corridors of the eternal verdict like a blade. Emergency lighting kicked on, painting everything in a harsh amber glow. And within 30 seconds, soldiers from 5 species were moving through the hallways with weapons drawn and sleep still fading from their eyes. Jake was already up. He had been sitting on the edge of his bunk, boots on, rifle in his lap, when the alarm sounded. He didn't rush. He stood, checked his charge cell one more time out of habit, and moved into the corridor at a steady pace. Not slow, not panicked, just ready. The distress signal had come from Pelis IV, a cold, rocky moon orbiting a gas giant at the edge of their patrol route. A Coalition science station was built into its surface, a small outpost of maybe 30 researchers studying deep space mineral formations. The signal they sent was short and broken, and ended in the middle of a word. That was never a good sign. Commander Vrax pulled up the threat assessment on the main screen in the operations deck. The word that came back from the Coalition database was one that made even the Vrethkai go still. Rekthul. They were not an army in the way most people understood armies. They were more like a tide, a death cult of mercenary soldiers who moved through the galaxy, taking contracts for destruction, and who had never once left a target alive. Their reputation was not built on bravery, it was built on relentlessness. They didn't fight smart or fight fair. They just kept coming until everything in front of them stopped moving. Vrax gave the squad their assignments in clipped, fast sentences. The main assault team, all Vrethkai, plus 2 Dunnery, would hit the front of the station head-on. A secondary flanking unit would move through the eastern wing of the station and secure the reactor core, which, if destroyed, would take the whole moon's surface with it. The flanking unit was 3 soldiers, Gora, Tesk, and Jake. Gora heard her assignment and said nothing, but the way her jaw tightened said plenty. Tesk, younger and less careful with his expressions, looked at Jake the way you look at something you've been handed that you didn't ask for and don't want. Jake looked at the map of the station's eastern wing and started memorizing it. They dropped in fast on a short-range shuttle, hitting the surface of Pellis IV in near darkness. The moon had no atmosphere worth speaking of, and the ground was hard gray rock, dusted with frost. The station rose ahead of them, a squat, reinforced structure built for function and nothing else, its outer lights flickering, and one section already venting smoke into the vacuum through a cracked seal. They moved to the eastern access hatch in silence. Gora led, Tesk behind her, Jake at the rear. Gora punched the override code, and the hatch slid open. Inside, the station's lighting was emergency only, dim red strips along the floor, casting long shadows in every direction. Jake pulled up the ventilation schematics on his wrist display. He had studied them during the 8-minute shuttle ride down. He already knew which corridors connected to which rooms, where the ceiling was lowest, which junctions had blind corners. The other 2 hadn't looked at the schematics at all. Vrethkai soldiers didn't usually need them. They trusted their senses and their size. Those 2 things had always been enough before. They moved through the first corridor without contact. Then the second. Then, in a wide junction near the reactor access passage, the world came apart fast. Rekthul soldiers, 4 of them, opened fire from behind a collapsed section of wall. The shots were tight and controlled, high-frequency plasma bursts that came with a sonic pulse built into each round. The sound hit like a fist, a deep oscillating frequency that rattled bones and scrambled balance. Gora went down hard on one knee, not from the plasma, but from the sonic pulse catching her inner ear, a Vrethkai weakness that the Rekthul had known about for a long time, and were very deliberate about using. A round clipped her left shoulder, burning through the outer layer of her armor, and scorching the scales beneath. Tesk froze completely. It was not cowardice. The Vrethkai called it the deep lock, a hardwired survival response to certain sonic frequencies that some Vrethkai soldiers carried in their biology and couldn't easily override. Tesk stood perfectly still, with his weapon half raised, every muscle seized, his eyes wide and aware, and completely unable to send instructions to his body. The Rekthul were already adjusting their aim. Jake moved before the thought was fully formed. He crossed the corridor in 4 fast steps, grabbed Gora by the back of her armor with both hands, and dragged her behind a thick support pillar. She was nearly twice his weight. He moved her anyway. She hit the pillar hard and caught herself, pressing both hands against the wound on her shoulder, while Jake was already reaching into his kit for a trauma seal. "Hold still," he said quietly. She held still, not because he told her to, because the calm in his voice was the kind of calm that made other people calm without meaning to. He pressed the thermal seal against the wound, heard it hiss as it bonded, and was already moving again before she could say anything. He checked Tesk, still locked, still standing, still alive, but useless for at least another 90 seconds. 4 Rekthul soldiers were advancing through the smoke. Jake looked up at the ceiling. The ventilation shafts ran directly above the junction, wide enough for one human body, angled in exactly the direction he needed. He jumped, caught the edge of the ceiling panel with both hands, and pulled himself up and in. What happened in the next 4 minutes was something neither Gora nor Tesk could fully see. They heard it, movement in the shafts above, too quiet for something that was moving that fast. Then sounds, Short, sharp sounds, 4 of them, spaced out, deliberate. Then silence. Then Jake dropped back down through the panel into the corridor. All 4 Rekthal soldiers were down. He had taken them apart one at a time from above, using the angle of the shafts to move between positions before any of them could find him. He had not fired a single shot. The corridor was quiet. Gora stared at him from behind the pillar. Tesk, the lock slowly releasing from his limbs, turned and looked at the bodies, and then at Jake, and then at the bodies again. Jake wiped his hands on the side of his pants, checked his rifle once, and looked down the next corridor. Reactor room is 60 meters, he said. We should move. They moved. When Vrax's main unit broke through the front of the station 12 minutes later and linked up with the flanking team, the eastern wing was completely clear. No Rekthal breathing, reactor intact, and Gora sitting against a wall with a sealed shoulder wound, looking at Jake like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't have a clean answer. Vrax looked at the bodies, counted them, looked at Jake. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. But the smirk he had worn since Jake came aboard was gone, and it did not come back. Somewhere behind him, one of the Dunnery soldiers quietly canceled the bet. The station smelled like burning wire and cold metal and something else. Something underneath both of those things that Jake recognized and didn't like. Fear had a smell, not a dramatic one. It was quiet, like stale air in a room where people have been holding their breath for a long time. He had first noticed it during training, when his unit had run live simulations in sealed environments. He had noticed it again in his first real deployment, and he noticed it now, moving through the inner corridors of the Pellis 4 station, knowing that somewhere deeper inside this building, 30 scientists were still alive and still waiting. Vrax split the units again. The main team would push through the central passage toward the station's command room. Jake's group, now down to Jake and Gora, since Tesk had been quietly reassigned to perimeter watch outside after the lock, would move through a parallel service corridor and come at the inner lab from the side. Gora walked close behind Jake now, not because she had been ordered to, she just did. Her shoulder was sealed and functional. She moved her arm carefully, but she moved it. She hadn't said anything to Jake since the junction, but she watched him with a different kind of attention than before. The way you watch something when you're still deciding what category to put it in, and none of your existing categories seem to fit. The service corridor was narrow, designed for maintenance drones, not soldiers. The ceiling was low enough that Gora had to duck slightly, her crest brushing conduit pipes running overhead. Jake walked through it straight and easy. They found the first body about 40 meters in. A station worker, young, in a standard-issue lab coat, curled near the base of a wall. Jake stopped, crouched, checked for a pulse, without any visible change in his expression. There wasn't one. He stood, noted the direction the worker had been running, and adjusted their route accordingly. Gora watched him process all of it in about 5 seconds. "You don't react," she said. Her translator collar kept her voice flat, but something underneath it wasn't. "I react," Jake said, moving again. "Just not on the outside." She followed. "Why not?" He thought about that for 2 steps. "Because if I let it hit me now, it slows me down, and slowing down in here gets more people killed." He glanced back at her briefly. "I'll let it hit me later." Gora had no answer for that. She filed it away somewhere and kept moving. The service corridor opened into a maintenance hub, a wide circular room filled with climate control machinery, all of it still running, filling the space with a low mechanical hum and a faint mist of temperature-regulated vapor. Through the grated floor panels beneath their feet, they could see the level below, and through a cracked viewport set into the far wall, they could see into the station's main research lab. Jake moved to the viewport first and looked through without touching the glass. The lab was large and well lit, which felt wrong given everything else. The scientists, 18 of them that he could count, with more likely pressed against walls out of sightline, were grouped at the far end of the room, some kneeling, some standing, very still. In front of them were 3 Rekthul soldiers, in full kit, weapons raised, doing what cornered killers do when they know their exit is closing. They were waiting for something to happen, so they had an excuse. And in the center of the room, facing the group of scientists with his back to the viewport, was Osh-Karath. Jake had read the file on him during the transit to Pellis 4. He'd read it fast, and remembered it completely. Osh-Karath was a Rekthul field commander, which meant he was not simply dangerous, he was intelligent and dangerous, which was a much harder combination to plan around. He was physically large, even by Rekthul standards, with armor that had been modified and rebuilt so many times it looked more like a personal collection than a uniform. He carried a long thermal blade at his hip, currently sheathed. He was talking. Jake couldn't hear the words through the viewport glass, but he could read the room. He could see what was coming before it arrived, the same way you can feel a storm before the first drop falls. He felt Gora come up behind him and look through the viewport. "How many?" she said quietly. 4, plus the commander. She assessed it the way Vrethkai soldiers assessed everything, through the lens of force and angle. "We can breach the main door. It'll be close." "Too close," Jake said. "They'll move on the hostages the moment the door starts." "Then what?" Jake was already scanning the maintenance hub. His eyes moved across the machinery, the conduit lines, the access panels set into the walls. They stopped on a ceiling-level hatch on the far side of the hub. Narrow, rectangular, positioned directly above the section of the lab where the 3 Rekthul soldiers were standing. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then it happened. Through the viewport, without warning, Osh-Karath turned to the group of scientists, reached out, and pulled one forward, a young man in a yellow research vest, who stumbled and nearly fell. Osh-Karath said something to the room. The scientists went very still. Then he did what he had come to do, a short, clean, terrible thing, and let the young man fall. The room behind the viewport went completely silent. Gora made a sharp sound, something between a snarl and a hiss, and started moving toward the door. Jake's hand came up and caught her arm. Not hard, just firm. She stopped, turned to look at him. His face had changed, not into rage, not into grief, though both of those things were somewhere in there. It had gone into something that was much harder to describe, and much more unsettling to look at. It was the face of a man who had made a decision, and was now simply on the other side of it, where the decision was already done, and everything that followed was just execution. Gora had fought in 7 campaigns. She had stood next to Vrethkai warriors, who were twice Jake's size and 3 times his age, going into their worst days. She had seen what soldiers looked like when they were ready. None of them had looked quite like this. Something moved in her chest that she did not have an easy name for. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to the feeling of standing near something very large in the dark, and suddenly understanding, for the first time, how large it actually was. Jake lowered his hand. Then he looked back at Gora. "I need 2 minutes," he said. "Hold here. If you hear the main door open, it means something went wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if nothing goes wrong?" He was already moving toward the hatch. "Then you won't need to do anything," he said. He pulled himself up and in, and the hatch closed behind him, and Gora stood alone in the humming dark of the maintenance hub, with the viewport and the lab beyond it, and the bodies and the waiting. She realized, standing there, that she was not worried about Jake. She was worried about what was going to happen to the people on the other side of that wall, specifically the Rekthul. The ventilation shaft above the lab was dark and tight, and smelled like recycled air and rust. Jake moved through it on his elbows and knees, Slow enough to be quiet, fast enough to matter. The metal beneath him was cold. The space was barely wide enough for his shoulders. It was the kind of place that no Vrethkai could have entered, no Dunari could have navigated without the sound of their exoskeletons scraping the walls, and no Rekthul soldier would have thought to worry about. It was, in other words, exactly the right place for him. He moved above the lab by feel and memory. He had looked at the room's layout through the viewport for about 30 seconds. That had been enough. He knew where the 3 guards were standing relative to the walls. He knew the ceiling height from the station schematics. He knew the approximate weight distribution of the graded panels, which ones would flex when he moved over them, and which ones were bolted solid. He tested each one with the heel of his palm before shifting his weight forward. None of them made a sound. Below him, through thin gaps in the paneling, he could see slivers of the lab, the white overhead lighting, the edge of a workbench, the boots of a Rekthul soldier, pacing in a slow, bored line. Osh-Karath had moved to the side of the room, near a communications terminal, apparently trying to reach someone. The 3 guards were arranged in a loose triangle around the remaining scientists. 17 left. 1 empty space on the floor, where the young man in the yellow vest had been. Jake did not look at that space for long. He positioned himself above the guard on the left side of the triangle, the one nearest the wall, the one with the shortest sightline to the others, the one who, if he went down quietly, would not be noticed for at least several seconds. Jake reached the correct panel, checked his angle, and waited. Waiting was something humans did that most other species found difficult to understand. Not the physical act. Any soldier could stay still. It was the internal part, the ability to slow everything down on the inside while keeping the outside ready. To be both completely calm and completely prepared at the same moment. Other species either relax too much or tense too soon. Humans, the ones trained right, found a line between the two and stood on it without moving. Jake stood on it now. The guard below completed his pace and turned back, facing away, weight on his forward foot. Jake moved the panel aside with one hand, dropped without a sound, and was behind the guard before the man's next breath. It was over in 4 seconds. No sound. The guard went down against the wall and stayed there. Jake caught the weapon before it hit the floor. 1. He was back in the shaft before anyone looked. He moved to the second position, the guard on the right, near the back wall. This one was more alert, turning his head in small increments, the way soldiers do when they start to feel something without knowing what it is. Instinct without information. Jake waited again, longer this time. He watched the rhythm of the guard's movement through the panel gap, the same way you watch a pendulum, not for any single swing, but for the pattern. When the moment opened, he took it. The second guard went down as quietly as the first. 2. The third guard was the problem. He was standing in the open, center of the room, between the scientists and the door, with clear sightlines in all directions and no wall to work against. Jake could not drop on him the same way. He studied the room from above for 12 seconds, which felt much longer. Then he saw it, a floor-level access panel on the far side of the lab, set into the baseboard where a conduit line ran under the wall. It connected to the service corridor where Gora was waiting. If he could reach it, he could come in at ground level, below the guard's natural sightline, from a direction the man had no reason to watch. Jake backed up through the shaft, reversed his route, found the connecting passage, and dropped down into the service corridor so quietly that Gora flinched anyway, not from sound, but from the sudden presence of him appearing next to her in the dark. He held up 3 fingers, pointed to himself, pointed to the floor panel at the base of the lab wall. She understood. He went in low and fast, through the panel, into the room at floor level. The third guard was 7 feet away, facing the scientists, his weapon raised in a casual grip. Jake crossed the distance before the guard's peripheral vision completed its sweep. 3. The scientists had been watching in complete silence. A few of them had their hands over their mouths. None of them made a sound. They understood, on some deep and wordless level, that the wrong noise at the wrong second would unravel everything. Oshkarath was still at the terminal. He had heard nothing. He still had his back partially turned. Jake stood up slowly from the third guard. He looked at Oshkarath. He looked at the remaining two Rekthul who had been standing near the commander and were now slowly starting to notice that the room felt different, that something in the air had changed, that their three colleagues were not where they had been a moment ago. The first of those two turned and found Jake standing there. For a single second, nobody moved. Then it went fast. Jake was already inside his reach, redirecting the arm upward, using the soldier's own momentum to put him into the wall hard enough to end the conversation. The second came from the side, bigger, faster than expected, and caught Jake across the face with a closed fist. Jake's head snapped to the side. He took a step back, felt the split open on his lip, tasted copper, and kept moving. He took the second soldier down with two strikes, low, then high, precise, efficient, no wasted effort, no dramatic gesture. 5 seconds. Oshkarath finally turned. He found Jake standing in the center of his cleared lab, breathing steadily through the nose, 4 of his 5 guards no longer conscious, the 5th already bound with his own cable, which Jake had stripped off him in the last 3 seconds. The Rekthul commander stared. Jake looked back at him with blood on his lip, and the calmest eyes Oshkarath had ever seen on anything that had just done what he had just done. There was no triumph in them, no performance, just a man at the end of a task, waiting for the next thing. What happened next was not a fight. Oshkarath was formidable, and in different circumstances, it might have been something worth watching. But Jake had been moving for 4 minutes in tight spaces, with no margin for error, and there was a locked-down, coiled quality to him now that Oshkarath, who had survived 30 years of contract killing by reading situations correctly, recognized for exactly what it was. He made the wrong choice anyway. Most of them did. 94 seconds later, the Rekthul commander was on the floor, wrists bound behind his back with his own restraint cable, breathing hard, unable to locate the exact sequence of moments that had led him here. Jake stepped over him, walked to the group of scientists still pressed against the far wall, and looked at the person standing closest to him, a young woman in a white coat, dark-haired, hands still shaking, eyes very wide. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. Couldn't speak yet. "You're okay now." The main lab door came down 30 seconds later as Vrax's unit finally breached it with a cutter. The door fell inward with a metallic crash, and Vrax stepped through with 6 soldiers behind him, weapons up, ready for the worst. He found Jake standing in the center of a cleared room with 17 live scientists, 1 bound Rekthul commander, and 5 unconscious soldiers arranged around the floor, like the room had exhaled them. Vrax stopped walking. He counted the bodies, slowly. Then he counted again. He looked at Jake. Jake was pressing a small field cloth against his split lip, more out of habit than concern. His expression was the same as it had been every other time Vrax had looked at him since he boarded the Eternal Verdict. Quiet, unhurried, waiting for the next thing to do. Vrax turned to Tesk, who had come in behind him. Tesk said nothing. He was doing the same math, and arriving at the same place. From near the door, Gora's voice came through the comms channel, in low Vrethkai. Not for translation, not for any of the humans or Denari to hear. Just 2 words, spoken to no one in particular, landing in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. What she said, translated, was, "I see it now." Vrax did not respond. He walked slowly across the lab floor, past the bodies, past the commander, past the scientists, and stopped in front of Jake. He stood there for a long moment, this massive, scarred, 7-foot creature who had laughed at a human soldier's file less than 2 days ago. He looked Jake in the eye. Then he stepped to the side and gestured toward the exit, giving Jake the lead. It was a small thing, just a movement, just a step to the side. But every soldier in that room saw it, and every soldier in that room understood exactly what it meant. The ride back to the eternal verdict was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from people having nothing to say. The kind that comes from people having too much and not knowing where to start. The shuttle held 12 soldiers from 4 different species and 1 human, and every one of them sat with the events of the last few hours somewhere behind their eyes. Turning it over, looking at it from different angles, the way you look at something that doesn't fit the shape of what you thought you knew. Jake sat near the back. His lip had stopped bleeding. He had a shallow burn on his ribs from the earlier plasma graze, the one Gora had watched him seal and ignore without changing his stride. It would bruise badly in a few hours. It would hurt more tomorrow than it did today. He knew that. He had been through enough of them to know the schedule of it. He leaned back against the hull wall and closed his eyes and let the shuttle vibrate through him, and did not sleep, but got close. Gora sat across from him. She watched him for a long time without being obvious about it, which among Vrethkai was considered a skill. She had fought since she was 14 years old. Her people pushed their young into training the way planets push rivers toward the sea, not by force, just by the natural shape of everything around them. She had earned her rank through campaigns on 3 different worlds, and she had thought she understood what made a soldier. She had a set of things she looked for: strength, speed, aggression, the willingness to go forward when everything in the body said go back. Jake had none of the first 2 in the way she had always measured them, and yet the other 2, those she could not deny. He had walked through that lab like someone emptying a room of furniture. Methodical, quiet, precise, unhurried, with a split lip and a sealed-over plasma burn and not one wasted movement. She was still trying to find the right shelf for it. When they docked and the shuttle bay doors sealed behind them, Vrax gathered the unit in the corridor outside the operations deck. He stood in front of them with his hands behind his back and looked at each of them in turn before he spoke. He said the mission had been completed within parameters. He said the hostages were secure. He said the after-action report would be filed in full, and that every soldier's performance would be noted accurately and without revision. Then he stopped, and he did something that nobody on the unit had ever seen Vrax do in the field. He turned to Jake directly and said in standard coalition, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Your performance was the deciding factor in this operation. It will be recorded as such." Jake looked up at him. "I was just doing my job," he said. "Yes," Vrax said, "and you did it better than the rest of us." He held Jake's gaze for another moment, and then dismissed the unit. Soldiers filed away in 1s and 2s, and the corridor slowly emptied until only Jake and Ska remained. Ska fell into step beside him as they walked toward the bunk room. The Denari moved quietly for something with 4 arms and a hard shell. He had a way of existing next to you that didn't press on you, which Jake had noticed and appreciated from the start. They walked for a while without talking. Then Ska said, "The bets have all been cancelled." Jake smiled at that, just a small one. "Who won?" "Nobody. They returned the currency. I think everyone was embarrassed to collect it." Jake nodded slowly. Ska clicked once, a thoughtful sound rather than a laughing one. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you were in the lab, when you were moving through the ceiling and the floor, taking them one by one, were you afraid?" Jake thought about it honestly. Not to manage the answer, just because it was a real question and it deserved a real one. "Yes," he said. Skaka's head tilted. "But you kept moving." "That's all fear is," Jake said. "Just noise in the background. You don't turn it off. You just don't let it pick the direction." Skaka was quiet for a moment. They reached the bunkroom door, and Jake put his hand on the frame to push it open, and Skukka spoke again. "Where does that come from? That—" He paused, searching for the word. "That stubbornness." Jake held the door and thought about it. He thought about a woman who ran 17 miles on a broken ankle to get her people home. He thought about a man who ran into a burning building and then went back and ran in again. He thought about a kitchen in a small house somewhere on Earth, where a woman named Carol Owens sat at a table past midnight, going through bills that didn't add up, and then got up the next morning anyway, and made breakfast, and sent her kids to school, and never said a word about the weight of it. "It's not something you're born with," Jake said finally. "It comes from where you're from, what happened to your people before you got here." He leaned against the doorframe. Humans didn't have anyone looking out for them for a long time. There was no coalition when our cities were burning. No allied fleet when we were at our worst moments. It was just us, trying to keep each other alive with whatever we had. He looked at the floor for a second, then back up. "That kind of history gets into you. It becomes part of what you are." Ska stood very still in the way Danari went still when they were processing something that mattered. "You were forged in hardship," he said. Jake nodded. "For a long time, yeah, we were." Ska made a sound that had no translation in standard coalition. It was the sound Danari made when they had moved something from the category of unknown to the category of understood. "I am glad you were assigned to this unit," he said. Then he went inside. Jake stood in the doorway a moment longer. Down the corridor, he could hear the low sounds of the ship, the hum of the engines, the soft click of systems cycling, the distant voices of soldiers from 5 different species settling into the rhythms of a ship at rest after a hard day. The eternal verdict was moving again, back on its patrol route, pointed at a sky full of unknown distances. He pushed off the doorframe and went inside. The next morning, if it could be called morning, Vrax called a full unit briefing. He pulled up a new mission file on the operations screen and let the details load without preamble. It was a deep strike operation into Rekthal-controlled space on the far side of the Chorus Nebula. 3 times the scale of Pellis IV, multiple hardened positions, coordinated assault required across 4 entry points simultaneously. And then Vrax did the other thing nobody expected. He read out the unit assignments. When he reached the tip of the spear, the forward assault position, the point of first contact, the most dangerous place in any operation, and the place that had been held, without exception, by Vrethkai soldiers since the unit was first assembled, he read a different name. The room was quiet. Jake looked up from the tactical map he had already been studying. Vrax met his eyes. "You have point," he said simply. Nobody in the room made any sound of objection. Not Gora, who stood to the right and gave a single slow nod. Not Tesk, who stared at the floor with something that might have been shame and might have been respect, and was probably both. Not any of the others, from any of the 5 species who had come aboard this ship, calling themselves the finest soldiers the galaxy had to offer. They had all seen the lab. They had all counted the bodies. They had all watched a small, soft, short-lived creature from a young species walk into the hardest room on that moon and come out the other side with a split lip and calm eyes, and ask the first person he reached if they were hurt. They knew what they were looking at now. Jake turned back to the tactical map. He studied the Rekthal positions, the terrain, the entry angles, the variables. He was already thinking ahead, past the briefing, past the transit, past the breach, to the decisions that would need to be made in the dark and the smoke, when everything was moving too fast for planning, and only instinct and training and stubbornness remained. The galaxy had spent 40 years looking at humanity and seeing something small, something new, something not quite ready. It had been wrong about all of it. And in the days that followed, in the campaign that was about to unfold, it would begin to understand that, in a way that none of its databases, its histories, or its long collective memory had ever quite prepared it for. Humanity didn't need to be the biggest thing in the room. It just needed to be the last thing standing. And somehow, against all expectation and every reasonable calculation, it almost always was.